Hermione Granger and the Philosopher's Stone. Chapter 8. The Potions Master. There were 142 staircases in Hogwarts. Wide, sweeping ones, narrow, rickety ones, some that led somewhere different on a Friday, some with a vanishing step halfway up that you had to remember to jump. Then there were doors that wouldn't open unless you asked politely or tickled them in exactly the right place, and doors that weren't really doors at all, but solid walls just pretending. It was also very hard to remember where anything was, because it all seemed to move around a lot. Thankfully, Hermione had a mind for those kinds of things and also scheduled time in between her classes to take a few walkthroughs of the building to create a map. Kind of. Because of the moving staircase, she couldn't make a complete map, but she had a good system. The only real thing that got in Hermione's way were the Hogwarts ghosts. It was always a nasty shock when one of them flew suddenly through a door you were trying to open. Nearly Headless Nick was always happy to point new Gryffindors in the right direction and had befriended Hermione straight away. But Peeves the Poltergeist was worth two locked doors and a trick staircase if you met him when you were late for class. Hermione was not a fan. She couldn't believe how childish he could be in such a sophisticated place. Her favorite ghost by far was a very nice ghost named Myrtle Warren in the second floor girls' lavatory. She had been a Ravenclaw before she was tragically murdered, though Hermione didn't pry into the details, and spent her afterlife there. Hermione heard some of the students refer to her as Moaning Myrtle, but didn't understand the nickname. Myrtle was quite nice to her, and she liked talking about all of the different things Hermione was learning in class. Myrtle was also knew Myrtle also knew when to just let Hermione sit and be quiet too. Hogwarts also had a caretaker named Argus Filch. He was a stickler for rules, which Hermione definitely appreciated, but he wasn't the least bit nice about it. Filch owned a cat called Mrs. Norris, a scrawny, dust-colored creature with bulging, lamp-like eyes, just like Filch's. She patrolled the corridors alone, breaking a rule in front of her, put just one toe out of line, and she'd whisked off for Filch, who'd appear wheezing 2 seconds later. Filch knew the secret passageways of the school better than anyone and could pop up as suddenly as any of the ghosts. The students all hated him, and it was the dearest ambition of many to give Mrs. Norris a good kick. Hermione had originally tried to befriend him in order to add the secret passageways to her kind of map, but Filch didn't seem to understand that she was doing it for scientific reasons, and instead grouped her in with all of the troublemakers. Hermione steered clear of Filch after that, both offended and intimidated. Hermione found all of her classes and teachers simply extraordinary. She was completely in her element. There was not one moment she ever found herself bored. Every minute of the day was spent learning something new. Hermione's sponge-like mind was soaking everything up. There were even a few times where Hermione felt a little overwhelmed, but it was actually a good thing. Keeping her mind busy with all of the new information helped her to keep her anxiety at bay. She couldn't think about being homesick or fitting in when there was so much to learn. Luckily for Hermione, Hogwarts had an owlery where she could borrow the school owls to deliver letters home to her parents. The first day she had to use two owls to carry all of the pages of her letters. There was just so much to write about. The return letters were not as robust, but Hermione didn't mind. Her parents made it abundantly clear they were proud of her, and that's all that mattered. Each morning, she'd wake up early for breakfast in the Great Hall. As one of the first students awake, Hermione was always able to snatch a current copy of the Daily Prophet, the wizarding newspaper, from the owls before all of the school copies were gone. She thought it only right to make sure she was up to date with all of the current events in the wizarding world in case anything came up in her classes. Always prepared. Students had to study the night skies through their telescopes every Wednesday at midnight and learn the names of different stars and the movements of the planets. Hermione absolutely loved every minute of it. 3 times a week, they went out to the greenhouses behind the castle to study herbology with a dumpy little witch called Professor Sprout. They learned how to take care of all the strange plants and fungi and found out what they were used for. Hermione never really had an affinity for plants, but the magical applications were fascinating. Easily the most interesting class was History of Magic, which was the only one taught by a ghost. One of the only ones Hermione thought was dignified enough for such a prestigious school. Professor Beans had been very old indeed when he had fallen asleep in front of the staff room fire and got up the next morning to teach, leaving his body behind him. Beans, unlike most of Hermione's muggle teachers, didn't care whether or not the class found him interesting or entertaining. He'd just go on and on about the important facts with no breaks for pleasantries. Professor Flitwick, the charms teacher, was a tiny little wizard who had to stand on a pile of books to see over his desk. At the start of their very first class, he took the roll call, and when he reached Harry's name, he gave an excited squeak and toppled out of sight. Most of the class chuckled, but Hermione didn't find it funny at all. Where History of Magic was full of solid facts, figures, dates, and events, Hermione's favorite thing to learn, she couldn't help but absolutely love charms. It was magical in every sense of the word. Hermione couldn't wait, however, for her second class on Thursday morning, Transfiguration with Professor McGonagall. She was so excited, in fact, she almost didn't read that morning's Daily Prophet. Hermione gently chided herself for almost overstep and sat down to read. Gringotts break-in latest. Investigations continue into the break-in at Gringotts on 31st of July, widely believed to be the work of dark wizards or witches unknown. Gringotts goblins today insisted that nothing had been taken. The vault that was searched had in fact been emptied the same day. But we're not telling you what was in there, so keep your noses out if you know what's good for you, said a Gringotts spokesgoblin this afternoon. How very odd. She remembered the incredible security at Gringotts Bank and was shocked someone would even attempt to break in. Whatever they were looking for must be extremely important to attempt something so stupid. Hermione filed the article in her brain to analyze later. It was almost time for class. She made sure to get to class early so she could get a first row seat. Professor McGonagall entered with a flourish. She demanded the students' attention just by walking to her desk at the front of the classroom. Transfiguration is some of the most complex and dangerous magic you will learn at Hogwarts, she said. Anyone messing around in my class will leave and not come back. You have been warned. Hermione sat smugly in her chair and looked at all of her classmates, willing them to even try. Then Professor McGonagall changed her desk into a pig and back again, much to the class's amazement. Some of her classmates thought that was what they'd learned in class that morning, which was just preposterous. Anyone with half a mind would realize that was pretty advanced magic. Can you demonstrate the switching spell as well? Hermione blurted out. She hadn't realized she had spoken out of turn in her utter excitement until she saw Professor McGonagall's head snap towards her. Please, she asked. The switching spell is reserved for your owl ear, Miss Granger. The way Professor McGonagall said it, Hermione knew the subject was closed. After taking a lot of complicated notes, they were each given a match and started trying to turn it into a needle. Hermione studied every single letter on the page for the spell and concentrated more than she had ever in her life. She tried and tried, but she only managed a very small transformation of the match. But that could have just been Hermione's imagination. She was nearly in tears by the end of the lesson and couldn't bear to look at Professor McGonagall's when she came over to check on her progress. Very nice, Miss Granger, Professor McGonagall said, examining Hermione's match. Now, class, take a look at Miss Granger's match. See how silver and pointy it is? It's not quite yet a needle, but it's extremely close. 10 points for Gryffindor. Hermione didn't even notice the scowls from her classmates. She was too fixated on the smile from Professor McGonagall. All of the first year students had been anticipating their defense against the dark arts class, especially because they would be taking it with no other than Harry Potter. But Quirrell's lessons turned out to be a bit of a joke. His classroom smelled strongly of garlic, which everyone said was to ward off a vampire he'd met in Romania and was afraid would be coming back to get him one of these days. His turban, he told them, had been given to him by an African prince as a thank you for getting rid of a troublesome zombie, but they weren't sure they believed this story. For one thing, when Seamus Finnegan asked eagerly to hear how Quirrell had fought off the zombie, Quirrell went pink and started talking about the weather. For another, they had noticed that a funny smell hung around the turban, and the Weasley twins insisted that it was stuffed full of garlic as well, so that Quirrell was protected wherever he went. Potions lesson took place down in one of the dungeons. It was colder there than up in the main castle, and it would have been quite creepy enough without the pickled animals floating in glass jars all around the walls. Snape, like Flitwick, started the class by taking the roll call. Unlike Flitwick, he paused at Harry's name. Ah, yes, he said softly. Harry Potter, our new celebrity. Draco Malfoy, the blonde boy Hermione had seen on Hogwarts Express, and his friends Crabbe and Goyle sniggered behind their hands. Snape finished calling the names and looked up at the class. You are here to learn the subtle science and exact art of potion making, he began. He spoke in barely more than a whisper, but they caught every word. As there is little foolish wand waving here, many of you will hardly believe this is magic. I don't expect you will really understand the beauty of this softly simmering cauldron with its shimmering fumes, the delicate power of liquids that creep through human veins, bewitching the mind, ensnaring the senses. I can teach you how to bottle fame, brew glory, even stopper death, if you aren't as big a bunch of dunderheads as I usually have to teach. Hermione was on the edge of her seat. She wanted to be ready for anything. She didn't want Professor Snape to think she was a dunderhead. Potter, said Snape suddenly. What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? She knew that one. It was her chance. Hermione's hand had shot into the air. I don't know, sir, said Harry. Snape's lips curled into a sneer. Fame clearly isn't everything. He ignored Hermione's hand. Hermione was slightly confused. Maybe he hadn't seen her? Let's try again. Potter, where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar? Hermione stretched the hand as high into the air as it would go without her leaving her seat. Professor Snape would see her this time. She was sure of it. Thought you wouldn't open a book before coming, huh, Potter? Snape was still ignoring Hermione's quivering hand. She couldn't believe it. Why wouldn't he call on her? What's the difference, Potter, between Monkswood and Wolfsbane? At this, Hermione stood up, her hand stretching towards the dungeon ceiling. I don't know, said Harry quietly. I think Hermione does, though. Why don't you try her? Hermione's hand dipped down a little bit at the shock of Harry Potter actually standing up for her. She didn't let the shock linger and put her hand back up as far as it would go. A few people laughed at Harry's quip. Snape, however, was not pleased. Sit down, he snipped at Hermione. He snapped at Hermione. Hermione's whole body felt like it was on fire. Her mind started reeling, and she felt that familiar bubble of anxiety growing. She forced herself to take a deep breath and assess the situation. There had to be a very clear and rational explanation for Professor Snape to be acting as he was. She looked at him closely. His cold, dark eyes were fixed upon Harry Potter. Finally, it clicked. It wasn't her. Snape was just doing this because he had some sort of problem with Harry. She'd have to investigate further after class. For your information, Potter, asphodel and wormwood make a sleeping potion so powerful it is known as the Draught of Living Death. A beeswax is a stone taken from the stomach of a goat, and it will save you from most poisons. As for monkshood and wolfsbane, they are the same plant, which also goes by the name of aconite. Well, why aren't you all copying that down? There was a sudden rummaging of quills and parchment. Over the noise, Snape said, and the point will be taken from Gryffindor House for your cheek, Potter. Hermione scrambled for her quill and ink so fast she nearly knocked it over everywhere. Beeswax, stomach of a goat, safe from poisons. Monkswood and wolfsbane, same plant, aconite, got it. And the point from Gryffindor House? Definitely a personal issue with Harry. Hermione was still rattled, but felt slightly better about herself. Things didn't improve for the Gryffindors as the potions lesson continued. Snape put them all into pairs and set them to mixing up a simple potion to cure boils. He swept around in his long black cloak, watching them weigh dried nettles and crush snake fangs, criticizing almost everyone except Malfoy, who he seemed to like. Hermione was flabbergasted. Her potion was loads better than Draco's. Professor Snape was just telling everyone to look at the perfect way Malfoy had stewed his horned slugs, when clouds of acid green smoke and a loud hissing filled the dungeon. Neville had somehow managed to melt Seamus' cauldron into a twisted blob, and their potion was sweeping across the stone floor, burning holes in people's shoes. Within seconds, the whole class was standing on their stools, while Neville, who had been drenched in the poison when the cauldron collapsed, moaned in pain, and angry red boils sprang up all over his arms and legs. Idiot boy, snarled Snape, clearing the spilled potion away with one wave of his wand. I suppose you added the porcupine quills before taking the cauldron off the fire? Neville whimpered as boils started to pop up all over his nose. Hermione started to run over to Neville, but Snape's glare stopped her in her tracks. He instead turned to Seamus. Take him up to the hospital wing. Snape spat at Seamus. Then he rounded on Harry and Ron, who had been working next to Neville. You, Potter, why didn't you tell him not to add the quills? Thought he'd make you look good if he got it wrong, did you? That's another point you've lost for Gryffindor. Hermione could almost feel the anger radiating off Harry. She kind of felt bad for him. Professor Snape definitely had it out for the boy who lived.